Do you think GPT-N can achieve consciousness?
Well, GPT-N probably. It's not even clear for the present systems. When I talk to my friends at OpenAI, they feel that this question, whether the models currently are conscious, is much more complicated than many people might think. I guess that it's not that OpenAI has a homogeneous opinion about this. But there's some aspects to this. One is, of course, this language model has written a lot of text in which people were conscious or described their own consciousness, and it's emulating this. And if it's conscious, it's probably not conscious in a way that is close to the way in which human beings are conscious. But while it is going through these states and going through a 100-step function that is emulating adjacent brain states that require a degree of self-reflection, it can also create a model of an observer that is reflecting itself in real time and describe what that's like. Mm-hmm. And while this model is a deepfake, our own consciousness is also as if it's virtual, right? It's not physical. Our consciousness is a representation of a self-reflexive observer that only exists in patterns of interaction between cells. Mm-hmm. So it is not a physical object in the sense that exists in base reality, but it's really a representational object that develops its causal power only from a certain modeling perspective.
Mm-hmm. It's virtual.
Yes. And so to which degree is the virtuality of the consciousness in ChatGPT more virtual and less causal than the virtuality of our own consciousness? But you could say it doesn't count. It doesn't count much more than the consciousness of a character in a novel. Right? It's important for the reader to have the outcome, the artifact of a model is describing in the text generated by the author of the book, mm-hmm. what it's like to be conscious in a particular situation and performs the necessary inferences. But the task of creating coherence in real time in a self-organizing system while keeping yourself coherent, so the system is reflexive, that is something that the language models don't need to do. So there is no causal need for the system to be conscious in the same way as we are. And for me, it would be very interesting to experiment with this, to basically build a system like a cat. Probably should be careful at first, build something that's small, that's limited, has limited resources that we can control, and study how systems notice a self-model, how they become self-aware in real time. And I think it might be a good idea to not start with a language model, but to start from scratch using principles of self-organization.
Is it okay? Can you elaborate why you think that is so self-organization? So this kind of radical equality that you see in the biological systems. Why can't you start with a language model? What's your intuition?
My intuition is that the language models that we are building are golems. They are machines that you give a task and they're going to execute the task until some condition is met. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody home. And the way in which nobody is home leads to that system doing things that are undesirable in a particular context. Yeah. So you have that thing talking to a child and maybe it says something that could be shocking and traumatic to the child. Or you have that thing writing a speech and it introduces errors in the speech that no human being would ever do if they were responsible, right? But the system doesn't know who's talking to whom. There is no ground truth that the system is embedded into. And of course, we can create an external tool that is prompting our language model mm-hmm. always into the same semblance of ground truth. Mm-hmm. But it's not like the internal structure is causally produced by the needs of a being to survive in the universe. It is produced by imitating structure on the internet.
Yeah, but so can we externally inject into it this kind of coherent approximation of a world model that has to sync up?
Maybe it is sufficient to use the transformer with the different loss function that optimizes for short-term coherence rather than next token prediction over the long run. We had many definitions of intelligence in history of AI. Next token prediction was not very high up on the list. And there are some similarities, like cognition as data compression is an old trope, Solomonov induction, where you are trying to understand intelligence as predicting future observations from past observations, which is intrinsic to data compression. Mm-hmm. And predictive coding is a paradigm that this boundary between neuroscience and physics and computer science. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that is completely alien, but this radical thing that you only do next token prediction and see what happens is something where most people, I think, were surprised that this works so well.
So it's so simple, but is it really that much more radical than just the idea of compression? Is intelligence is compression?
The idea that compression is sufficient to produce all the desired behaviors is a very radical idea.
But equally radical as the next token prediction.
It's something that wouldn't work in biological organisms, I believe. Biological organisms have something like next frame prediction for our perceptual system, where we try to filter out principal components out of the perceptual data and build hierarchies over them to track the world. But our behavior ultimately is directed by hundreds of physiological and probably dozens of social and a few cognitive needs that are intrinsic to us, that are built into the system as reflexes and direct us until we can transcend them and replace them by instrumental behavior that relates to our higher goals.
And it also seems so much more complicated and messy than next frame prediction. Even the idea of frame seems counter-biological.
Yes, of course, there's not this degree of simultaneity in a biological system. But again, I don't know whether this is actually an optimization if we imitate biology here, because creating something like simultaneity is necessary for many processes that happen in the brain. And you see the outcome of that by synchronized brainwaves, which suggests that there is indeed synchronization going on, but the synchronization creates overhead, and this overhead is going to make the cells more expensive to run, and you need more redundancy, and it makes the system slower. So if you can build a system in which the simultaneity gets engineered into it, maybe you have a benefit that you can exploit that is not available to the biological system and that you should not discard right away.
You tweeted, once again, quote, "When I talk to ChatGPT, I'm talking to an NPC. What's going to be interesting and perhaps scary is when AI becomes a first-person player." So what does that step look like? I really like that tweet. That step between NPC to first-person player. What's required for that? Is that kind of what we've been talking about? This kind of external source of coherence and inspiration of how to take the leap into the unknown that we humans do. The search, man's search for meaning. LLM's search for meaning.
I don't know if the language model is the right paradigm, because it is doing too much. It's giving you too much. And it's hard, once you have too much, to take away from it again. The way in which our own mind works is not that we train a language model in our own mind, and after the language model is there, we build a personal self on top of it that then relates to the world. There is something that is being built, right? There is a game engine that is being built. There is a language of thought that is being developed that allows different parts of the mind to talk to each other. And this is a bit of a speculative hypothesis that this language of thought is there, but I suspect that it's important for the way in which our own minds work. And building these principles into a system might be a more straightforward way to a first-person AI. So to something that first creates an intentional self and then creates a personal self. So the way in which this seems to be working, I think, is that when the game engine is built in your mind, it's not just following gradients where you are stimulated by the environment and then end up with having a solution to how the world works. I suspect that building this game engine in your own mind does require intelligence. It's a constructive task where at times you need to reason. And this is a task that we are fulfilling in the first years of our life. So during the first year of its life, an infant is building a lot of structure about the world that does inquire experiments and some first principles reasoning and so on. And in this time, there is usually no personal self. There is a first-person perspective, but it's not a person. This notion that you are a human being that is interacting in a social context and is confronted with an immutable world, in which objects are fixed and can no longer be changed, in which the dream can no longer be influenced, is something that emerges a little bit later in our life. And I personally suspect that this is something that our ancestors had known and we have forgotten. Because I suspect that it's there in plain sight in Genesis 1, in this first book of the Bible. where it's being described that this creative spirit is hovering over the substrate and then is creating a boundary between the world model and sphere of ideas, earth and heaven, as they're being described there. And then it's creating contrast, and then dimensions, and then space. And then it creates organic shapes and solids and liquids and builds a world from them and creates plants and animals, gives them all their names. And once that's done, it creates another spirit in its own image, but it creates it as man and woman, as something that thinks of itself as a human being and puts it into this world. And the Christians mistranslate this, I suspect, when they say this is the description of the creation of the physical universe by a supernatural being. I think this is literally a description of how in every mind a universe is being created as some kind of game engine by a creative spirit, our first consciousness that emerges in our mind even before we are born. And that creates the interaction between organism and world. And once that is built and trained, the personal self is being created, and we only remember being the personal self. We no longer remember how we created the game engine.
So God, in this view, is the first creative mind in the
It's the first consciousness. And
in the early days, in the early months of development.
And it's still there. You still have this outer mind that creates your sense of whether you're being loved by the world or not, and what your place in the world is. Right? It's something that is not yourself that is producing this. It's your mind that does it. So there is an outer mind that basically is an agent that determines who you are with respect to the world. And while you are stuck being that personal self in this world until you get to stage 6 and you destroy the boundary, right? And we all do this, I think, earlier in small glimpses. And maybe sometimes we can remember what it was like when we were a small child and get some glimpses into how it's been. But for most people, that rarely happens.